Dawn crept over Thorn Ranch like a shy spirit, brushing pale gold across the frost-kissed fields and stirring the dust that slept on every fence rail. The morning felt softer than usual, as if the land itself paused to listen. A single wagon rolled along the quiet road, its wheels groaning under the weight of a young Chinese woman who clutched a bundle of folded cloth to her chest. Her name was Li Mei, though few in this valley had ever spoken it with kindness. She had walked miles before sunrise, past towns that glanced at her with the same coldness as winter mud, until the long gray roof of the Thorn Ranch kitchen finally rose ahead like a reluctant promise. She stepped down from the wagon carefully, boots touching earth as though she feared she might disturb some unseen peace. The air smelled of wood smoke and unpicked sage. She breathed it in, gathered her courage, and touched the frayed ribbon tied around her wrist, her sister's ribbon, now dulled by worry. A whisper of guilt tugged at her chest. Hannah should have been here, greeting the morning with flower-stained hands and a laugh that defied hardship, but fever had taken her voice to a whisper and her strength to almost nothing. So Li Mei had come in her place, hoping to hold her sister's job long enough for her to survive. The kitchen door stood slightly open, breathing out warmth and the faint scent of coffee. Li Mei reached for it, but before her fingers touched the wood, a rough voice from behind made her flinch. "You're not Hannah." She turned and found Caleb Thorne standing a few yards away, coat unbuttoned, hair unkempt, eyes shadowed by a sleepless night. He was a tall man, strong in a quiet, weary way, as if life had pressed weight after weight upon him but never crushed him entirely. His jaw was tense, his gaze sharp, and the bitterness in his voice cut deeper than any winter wind. "No, sir," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "My sister. She is sick. Too sick to stand. She asked me to come." Caleb's boots crunched on the frost as he approached, the edges of impatience shaping every step. "I hired her. Not you." Li Mei bowed her head, fingers twisting the ribbon at her wrist. "She needs the pay. I will work hard. I will try to be useful in the kitchen." He let out a breath that came from somewhere tight and wounded inside him. Caleb Thorne was no stranger to hardship, the drought, the debts, the loneliness of a house that echoed with memories he couldn't bear to open. But he had counted on Hannah's steady presence, the one reliable thread in a life unraveled. The sight of this quiet stranger, so small and fragile against the vast ranch, stirred a discomfort he didn't have the words to name. "This was a mistake," he muttered, turning away. "Town's already got enough to talk about." Li Mei swallowed, shame burning her throat. She knew the gossip. She had heard the whispers whenever she walked through town, those Liang sisters, foreign blood taking up space. She could feel their stares even here, miles away. But her sister needed medicine. She needed hope. And Li Mei had nothing but her hands to offer. "I will only stay today," she said softly. "If you do not like my work, I will leave before night." Caleb paused at the doorway. It wasn't her words that stopped him but the tremor beneath them, a tremor of someone who had endured 100 rejections and was preparing for one more. For a moment, something in him wavered, conscience, memory, or maybe something older than either. Without looking back, he pushed the door open wider. "Fine. One day." Li Mei stepped inside, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around her like an unexpected kindness. Sunlight filtered through the small windows, painting dust motes in lazy spirals above the counter. Copper pans hung like aging moons along the walls. The quiet hum of the ranch waking up echoed through the boards beneath her feet. She tied her sister's apron, its strings worn soft by years of work, and began to move with gentle certainty. She boiled water, sifted flour, chopped onions with a rhythm she'd learned watching Hannah. Her sleeves gathered the glow of lantern light, her breath warmed the cold edges of the morning. The kitchen responded to her presence as if remembering an old melody, careful, steady, hopeful. From the doorway, Caleb watched. He folded his arms, annoyed at himself for lingering but unable to step away. Her movements held a grace he hadn't expected, a quiet determination that softened the hard lines of the room. It unsettled him, reminding him of something he had locked inside, a longing he'd sworn he was done feeling. Outside, boots stomped on frozen dirt. Deputy Rudd Carter passed by the open window, muttering to a ranch hand, "Caleb's got a Chinese girl cooking now? Guess folks will do anything to save a coin." Laughter followed, ugly and sharp. Li Mei heard it. Her knife paused mid-air, hand trembling for one fragile heartbeat. Then she lowered her head and kept cutting, her expression unreadable. Caleb watched her shoulders stiffen, watched her swallow down the sting without protest. The sight hit him harder than he expected, stirring a flicker of anger beneath his ribs. Not at her, but at the cruelty she accepted without defense. Breakfast finished slowly. Warm biscuits, soft eggs, a broth simmered from bones she'd found in the pantry. Caleb sat at the table, still frowning, still unsure why he felt drawn and unsettled all at once. Li Mei placed a plate before him and stepped back, hands clasped tightly at her waist. He picked up a fork, stabbed a piece of biscuit, and took one bite. He froze. The flavors, simple, tender, familiar, tasted like mornings before life had hardened him. Mornings when his mother had cooked at that same stove, humming a song no one remembered now. Something in his chest tightened, a thread of old grief pulling taut. He put the fork down slow, eyes dropping to the plate as if it held a memory. Li Mei watched him with guarded hope, breath caught in the hollow of her throat. Caleb lifted his gaze at last, and though his voice was low, it carried a weight that filled the room. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Li Mei hesitated, heart thudding softly against her ribs. "From my mother," she murmured. "And from watching Hannah. I wanted to make something that felt gentle." Caleb's jaw flexed, something unreadable passing across his face. For the first time that morning, his eyes softened, not much, but enough to shift the air between them. Enough to make Li Mei's breath tremble. Then, from outside, a ranch hand shouted, "Caleb, you'd better come see this." Caleb stood abruptly, chair legs scraping against the wooden floor. The call carried urgency, something gone wrong. He paused at the doorway, glancing back at Li Mei, a flicker of hesitation holding him there. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Li Mei wondered if her presence had stirred something far more complicated than anger inside the man whose world she had just stepped into. The morning settled into a quiet rhythm after Caleb stepped out, leaving Li Mei alone in the kitchen with the fading warmth of his presence. The silence felt different now, not quite as sharp, not quite as wary. She washed the dishes with careful strokes, letting the warm water soothe the nervous tremor in her hands. For the first time since dawn, she allowed herself a single, cautious breath of relief, though she dared not name it hope. Outside the window, frost melted into tiny threads of silver under the strengthening sun, and the ranch awoke with its usual mixture of creaking fences, lowing cattle, and the distant thud of boots. Caleb returned not long after, his expression drawn tight again. Li Mei glanced at him, searching for any sign of what had happened outside, but he gave nothing away. He wiped his boots on the mat and stepped into the kitchen without a word, the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. She instinctively straightened, gripping the dish towel. Whatever he'd been summoned to see had not softened him. His eyes flicked to her, then away. "The east fence fell," he muttered. "Wind must have knocked it loose last night." Li Mei nodded, unsure what response he expected. Her sister used to talk freely. Hannah had always been bold, warm, aflame in a draft-filled world, but Li Mei lived gently, as if every word needed permission to breathe. She could sense Caleb's mood tightening like rope around a post. Something about the morning, the ranch, or maybe the sight of her itself, was stirring discomfort he didn't want to look at directly. She cleared her throat, barely audible. "Can I help with anything?" His gaze snapped to her, sharp with surprise. "Help? With fence work?" She lowered her eyes quickly. "Maybe not the fence, but I can fix things inside. Clean, mend, cook more." Caleb exhaled slowly, the edges of irritation softening. "Just stick to the kitchen for now." "Yes, sir." The "sir" made his shoulders stiffen. He didn't know why. But he left it unchallenged and stepped back outside, boots thudding against the porch. Li Mei listened until his footsteps faded into the distance. Then she returned to work, taking every task in hand with a sense of quiet purpose, scrubbing the long wooden table, washing the old iron pot, sweeping the corners where dust collected like forgotten worries. She moved with a deliberate grace, as though each motion carried prayer. Mid-morning brought a knock on the back door. Li Mei froze, hand hovering above the flour tin. Mrs. Finch, the boarding house widow with kind eyes and a sharp tongue, stepped inside with a basket of herbs. She paused at the sight of Li Mei. "Oh," the widow said, blinking slowly. "You must be Hannah's sister." Li Mei bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am. Your sister's a good woman. Hard worker. Folks will miss her around here." Mrs. Finch took a long moment to study her, eyes drifting from her delicate hands to her quiet posture. "Town will talk," she warned gently. "They always do." Li Mei pressed her lips together, letting the truth settle. "I understand." "Caleb's a stubborn man," Mrs. Finch said, placing the herbs on the counter. "A good man, but hard as wagon steel. Don't take his temper too personally." Li Mei hesitated, glancing toward the window where the ranch stretched in golden waves. "He does not like me." Mrs. Finch raised a knowing brow. "He doesn't like much of anything these days." She softened. "Loss changes a person. Makes them guard themselves so fiercely they start cutting their own hands on the shields they carry." Li Mei didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway, grateful for the kindness. When Mrs. Finch left, silence returned, warmer than before. Hours passed gently. Li Mei found the mending basket in the corner and began stitching a split in one of Caleb's work shirts. The fabric was coarse beneath her fingers, the scent of sun and dust clinging to it. A strange, unfamiliar ache tugged at her chest. Pity, maybe, or the loneliness of a man who wore burdens heavier than cattle feed. When Caleb returned for lunch, he paused at the sight of her stitching. She felt his gaze long before she dared meet it. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Mending," she whispered. He stepped closer, the floorboards complaining under his weight. The shirt lay across her lap, needle glinting in the soft light. "You don't have to do that." She continued stitching, keeping her voice steady. "It was torn. And I know how." He studied her, trying to reconcile this gentle determination with the stranger he'd barked at hours earlier. Something about the way she held the shirt, careful, respectful, as if even another person's weary fabric deserved kindness, unsettled him. "You don't owe me anything," he muttered. Li Mei's hands faltered. "It's not about owing." He didn't ask what she meant. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The afternoon deepened. Caleb set about chopping wood, and Li Mei remained in the kitchen, cooking dinner with the soft hum of memory guiding her hands. The scent of ginger and broth drifted through the house. When she gingerly stepped outside to gather herbs from the porch, she found Caleb pausing mid-swing of the axe, staring at the horizon as if something inside him was unraveling. She hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt him. But the quiet ache in his stance, shoulders rigid, hand gripping the handle too tightly, made her speak. "You are tired," she said softly. He stiffened, startled that she'd noticed. "Work doesn't care if a man's tired." "No," she agreed. "But I care if he bleeds." Caleb blinked at her, the words landing heavier than she intended. Her eyes widened with embarrassment, and she stepped back quickly, retreating into the kitchen with lowered head. But something shifted in him then. An invisible line, pulled taut for too long, loosened by the gentlest tug. Evening settled like a blanket over the ranch. They shared a quiet supper, the crackling of the stove filling the spaces where fear once hovered. Caleb ate slowly, as if each bite required reflection. When Li Mei rose to pour more tea, he watched her with a question forming behind his eyes. But he didn't ask it. Not yet. Night arrived colder than the morning had been, and as Li Mei cleaned the table, a sudden gust slammed the shutters against the house. She jumped, hand flying to her chest. The lantern flame quivered. Caleb rose, instantly alert. Storms rolling in. Thunder murmured in the distance. Soft now, but growing. Li Mei stood frozen, the memory of past storms whispering through her bones. Caleb saw it, the fear, the trembling restraint. "Hey," he said quietly, stepping closer. "You're safe here." She looked up at him, breath unsteady. But before either could speak again, the front door burst open, and a ranch hand, soaked in sweat, shouted, "Caleb, Rudd Carter's coming up the road." "And he's not alone." Caleb's eyes hardened. Li Mei's breath faltered. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one heading toward their door. The storm had settled into a low growl by the time Rudd Carter reached Caleb's porch, bringing 2 ranch hands with him, men who loved a spectacle more than sleep. The wind tugged at their coats, and lantern light carved uneasy shadows across the yard. Caleb stood in the doorway, broad and unmoving, his presence filling the space with a quiet force that made even the ranch hands hesitate. Rudd tipped his hat back, exposing eyes sharpened with spite. "Evenin', Thorne," he said, voice slurred with drink and arrogance. "Heard you replaced Hannah with her little sister. Thought I'd come see the upgrade." Li Mei shrank behind the kitchen doorway at the sound of his voice, heart ricocheting against her ribs. She had seen men like Rudd before, men who dressed their cruelty in a grin, who spoke as if other people's dignity were clay in their fists. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, knuckles paling. Caleb's jaw flexed. "Say what you came to say, Rudd." Rudd clicked his tongue, pretending disappointment. "Just making sure the rumors are true. Folks in town are saying you're keeping the foreign girl under your roof, letting her handle your food, your house, maybe even you." The other men chuckled, low and cruel. Li Mei closed her eyes, burning with shame she did not earn. Caleb stepped forward, blocking their view of the doorway entirely. "Watch your mouth." Rudd raised his hands in false innocence. "Didn't say anything untrue. Town don't like it, Caleb. You know how people are about her kind." "My kind," Li Mei whispered under her breath, a bitter tremor slipping past her lips. The words stung more than she expected, not because she doubted their prejudice, but because of how quickly it came for her, even here, even after doing nothing more than trying to work. Rudd smirked. "Maybe I should talk to her directly. Make sure she knows the rules around here." Caleb's hand shot out, gripping the man's coat front with a force that silenced the wind itself. "You take one step toward her, and you'll regret it." Rudd's smirk faltered, but pride made him reckless. "Didn't think you'd care so much about a cook." "She's not just a cook," Caleb ground out, surprising even himself with the truth of it. The moment hung there, fragile, dangerous, revealing more than Caleb meant to show. The ranch hands exchanged glances, sensing the shift. Rudd twisted out of Caleb's grip, straightening his collar with a sneer. "Town's watchin', Thorne. You want trouble? Keep hidin' her." Caleb didn't respond. He simply stood still, fists trembling with everything he refused to say. After a final glare, Rudd turned on his heel and stalked away into the storm. His men followed, their laughter fading across the yard like the tail end of a bad dream. When the door finally closed, the house exhaled a long, heavy silence. Li Mei stepped out slowly, her face pale. "I am sorry." Caleb blinked at her, thrown by the apology. "Sorry? For what he said?" "For causing trouble," she whispered. "For making the town angry. For making you fight." "You didn't make me fight," he said softly, though the words scraped against the truth inside him. "He did." She stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "But I am the reason he came." "Li Mei," Caleb said, the syllables of her name unfamiliar but strangely gentle in his mouth. "None of this is your fault." The words landed like a fragile gift she didn't know how to accept. Something in her chest warmed and ached at once. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "Let's just get through the night." The storm intensified, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. Caleb moved around the kitchen with restless energy, lighting lanterns to keep the shadows from swallowing the room. Li Mei prepared tea, hands still trembling. When she offered him a cup, he accepted without meeting her eyes, as if holding her gaze might uncover something he wasn't ready to face. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant, the kind that echoed deep in the belly of the earth. "You're shaking," Caleb observed quietly. Li Mei forced a small smile. "Storms are loud where I come from. They shake the roofs, rattle the walls. My mother always held my hand." Caleb stared at the floor, guilt tugging at him for reasons he couldn't articulate. "You shouldn't have to face storms alone." Her breath caught, and for a moment she wasn't sure if he meant the one outside, or the one inside these walls? They worked side by side for a while, both pretending not to notice the strange new things stirring between them. When Caleb reached for a wooden bowl at the same time she did, their fingers brushed. Li Mei flinched, startled by the spark of warmth that leaped through her. Caleb hesitated, then withdrew his hand quickly as though he feared the feeling, whatever it was. The air tightened. To distract herself, she returned to mending his shirt, stitching under the flicker of lamplight. Caleb watched from across the room, unable to ignore the sight of her bent over his battered clothing with such quiet devotion. It stirred something buried, a forgotten longing for a gentler life, a softer presence, a home that felt like more than walls. The storm eased gradually, but the tension inside the house did not. Finally, Li Mei spoke. "Caleb, why do they hate me?" His head lifted sharply. "They don't hate you. They hate change. They hate anything they don't understand." "Then they hate me," she whispered. He didn't answer, because he knew she was right. Instead, he picked up the mended shirt from her lap and studied it. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." She lowered her gaze. "I wanted to." The sincerity of it pressed into him like an old wound healing too fast to make sense. Before he could find words, a sharp knock struck the front door, urgent, heavy, unmistakably serious. Caleb tensed. "Stay here." Li Mei's breath froze as he strode toward the entryway. She stood behind the kitchen doorway again, just as she had earlier that morning, clutching the counter not out of shame this time, but fear of what waited on the other side of the wood. Caleb opened the door to a drenched stable hand gasping for air. "Boss, you need to come. It's about Hannah." Li Mei stepped forward, heart plunging. "What happened?" she whispered. The stable hand swallowed hard, eyes darting between her and Caleb. "It's bad. Real bad." And just like that, the storm outside became nothing compared to the one breaking loose inside their hearts. Rain still clung to the stable hand's hat brim as he repeated the words that hollowed the room. "It's Hannah!" She took a turn. Li Mei swayed where she stood, her breath slipping out in a fragile tremor. The storm outside seemed to lean closer, as if the wind itself waited to hear what would happen next. Caleb steadied her without speaking, one hand on her arm, a touch that felt both grounding and unbearably gentle. "How bad?" Caleb asked. The stable hand hesitated, shifting on muddy boots. "Doctor says she's burning up. Fever's too high. They don't know if she'll see sunrise." Li Mei's knees weakened. Everything she'd been holding together, hope, duty, stubborn bravery, cracked like thin ice. "I have to go," she whispered. "I have to get to her." Caleb nodded once, already reaching for his coat. "I'll saddle the horses." They left without a word wasted. Lantern light streaked across the porch as they hurried into the rain-slick night. The storm had softened into a cold drizzle, but thunder still rolled across the hills like distant drums. Caleb lifted Li Mei onto the horse with surprising gentleness, then climbed onto his own mount. The horses broke into a gallop, hooves throwing up sparks of wet earth. The ride to town felt longer than any stretch of land Li Mei had ever crossed. Wind whipped her braid against her cheek. Rain stung her eyes. She leaned forward, praying to every ancestor she knew, begging them to keep Hannah breathing. Caleb rode beside her, jaw set, eyes narrowed against the dark. He didn't speak, but the tension in his shoulders told her he carried her fear as if it were his own. When the town lights finally flickered into view, relief and dread tangled together in Li Mei's chest. A single lantern burned outside the boarding house. Caleb dismounted first and reached for her again, helping her down as though she might shatter if he let go too fast. Inside, the hallway was dim and still. Mrs. Finch met them with tired eyes. "She's upstairs," she murmured. "Doctor's with her. But you'd best prepare yourself." The warning sliced through Li Mei like a blade. She followed Mrs. Finch up the narrow staircase, her steps barely touching the wood. Caleb stayed close, each of his footsteps a steady echo behind her. Hannah lay beneath a thin quilt, breath ragged, cheeks flushed with fever. The doctor knelt beside her, wiping her brow with a damp cloth. Li Mei rushed forward, falling to her knees. "Jia," she whispered in Chinese, voice cracking. "I'm here." Hannah's eyelids fluttered, her gaze struggling to focus. "May," she breathed, voice trembling like a fading candle flame. Li Mei grasped her sister's hand, pressing it to her cheek. "I'm here. You're not alone." Caleb watched from the doorway, hat held low, as if afraid his presence might intrude upon something sacred. A heaviness settled over him, a guilt he didn't fully understand. He had come to rely on Li Mei's quiet presence so quickly, and now he could see how fragile her world truly was. "She shouldn't have worked so hard," Li Mei whispered through trembling lips. "She pushed herself for me. For everything." Mrs. Finch placed a hand on her shoulder. "Your sister is strong, child. Stronger than any fever I've seen." But even in her attempt at comfort, there was hesitation. The doctor rose with a sigh, rubbing his temples. "There's little more I can do tonight. Fever has to break on its own." He nodded to Li Mei. "Stay with her. Keep her cool. Talk to her. Sometimes the body hears more than we think." When he left, the room grew even quieter, lit only by a single lamp flickering in the corner. Li Mei dipped a cloth in cool water and laid it against Hannah's burning brow. Her hands trembled, each movement careful and tender. Caleb stepped forward at last, hesitant. "Li Mei, do you need anything? More water? Firewood?" His voice carried a softness she had not heard before, as if grief had peeled something open inside him. She didn't look up. "I just need her to live." Caleb's throat tightened. "I know." Minutes stretched into hours. Rain rattled faintly at the window. Hannah murmured in half-dreams, slipping in and out of consciousness. At one point, she whispered Li Mei's name, then fell silent again. Li Mei pressed her forehead to the mattress, shoulders shaking. Caleb took a slow step toward her before he could think better of it. He placed a hand on her back, gentle, steady, firm enough that she felt the warmth of another human anchoring her in the storm of her fear. "You're not alone," he said quietly. His words cracked something in her. She turned her face away, tears slipping down her cheeks in silent surrender. She didn't push him back, didn't apologize for breaking. She simply let the moment hold her. Mrs. Finch watched from the hallway, her expression softening. She leaned toward Caleb, whispering, "You stand by her like that, and people will talk even more." Caleb didn't look away from Li Mei. Let them. The hours deepened. The fever held its grip. Li Mei changed the cloth again and again, singing under her breath in the old lullaby her mother used to hum when storms rattled their walls back home. Her voice was thin but steady, threading comfort into the dim room. Caleb listened, struck by the aching tenderness in her song. Something inside him shifted, slow and undeniable. He realized how fiercely he wanted to protect her, not out of duty or pity, but out of something he didn't dare name yet. Just past midnight, Hannah stirred again, eyes opening halfway. She looked between Li Mei and Caleb, confusion briefly giving way to clarity. "Mei," she whispered. Stay where you're safe." Li Mei squeezed her hand. "I'm safe. Caleb brought me." Hannah's gaze landed on the man standing by the bed. A faint, knowing smile flickered across her fevered lips. "Good," she whispered. "Good choice." Li Mei blinked, startled by the implication. Caleb looked away, suddenly unsteady. Before Li Mei could speak, Hannah's breath hitched sharply, then fell into a frighteningly shallow rhythm. Panic surged through the room like a gust of wind. "Caleb, get the doctor!" Li Mei cried, voice breaking. Caleb spun for the doorway, boots thundering down the stairs. Li Mei clutched her sister's hand tighter, heart pounding, as Hannah's chest rose once, then again, but not evenly. A cold realization swept over her. Something was changing. Something terrifying. And as the lantern flickered beside the bed, the flame bending violently to one side, Li Mei understood with a chilling clarity that the night was not done testing the fragile thread of the life she held in her hands. Hannah's breaths came shallow, then shallower still, as if each one was fighting through a wall of heat. Li Mei pressed the cool cloth against her sister's forehead again, whispering prayers that quivered like candle flames. "Hold on, Jie," she murmured. Please, hold on. The room smelled of sweat, damp linen, and fear. Outside, the storm softened into a mournful drizzle. It felt as though even the sky bowed its head. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Caleb burst back into the room with the doctor close behind. The doctor knelt immediately at Hannah's bedside, fingers pressed to her neck, eyes narrowing. Her fever's peaked, he said quietly. This is the turning point. Either it breaks now, or it doesn't. Li Mei's throat tightened. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed, his hands knotting and unknotting. The only sound was Hannah's ragged breathing, each inhale a fragile thread. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Li Mei wiped her sister's brow, whispering stories from their childhood. Shared harvests, evenings of folded paper lanterns, their mother's laughter, the nights they slept by the same window listening to the same storms. Caleb watched the scene, feeling something he had never felt before, a helpless longing to take Li Mei's suffering from her hands and carry it himself. Then, slowly, miraculously, Hannah's breath steadied. The tightness in her chest eased. When Li Mei touched her skin again, it was no longer fire-hot. It was cooling, still warm, but not burning. The doctor exhaled with relief. Her fever's breaking. Li Mei released a sob, half laughter, half collapse. She bowed over Hannah's hand and kissed it, tears falling freely. Caleb stepped forward, the breath he'd held finally leaving him. Mrs. Finch whispered a soft thank you to the silent heavens. Hannah's eyelids fluttered open. May? She whispered, voice frail but clear. Li Mei cupped her cheek. I'm here. I'm here, Jie. Hannah's eyes drifted toward the doorway, where Caleb stood with quiet reverence, hat still in his hands even though he'd forgotten he was holding it. Mr. Thorne, she whispered. Caleb stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. You scared us. Hannah smiled faintly. Not my intention. The doctor gave instructions for rest and medicines, then left, followed by Mrs. Finch. The room quieted again, but now it was the silence of relief, not dread. Hannah squeezed Li Mei's fingers. You stayed, she whispered. Li Mei nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek. Of course. Hannah's gaze moved to Caleb again. Something softened in her expression. Take care of her. Li Mei blinked at the words. Caleb's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. But Hannah was already drifting into sleep again, her breathing steady and safe. Li Mei stood slowly, her legs trembling from a night without rest. Caleb stepped forward instinctively. You need to lie down, he said. I'm fine, she murmured. You're shaking. She hadn't realized it until he said so. Her entire body trembled with the recoil of fear and relief, exhaustion settling into her bones. Caleb touched her elbow, lightly, careful not to startle her. Come downstairs. You need air. Li Mei hesitated, then allowed him to guide her out of the room. They walked down the creaking staircase, her steps unsteady, his presence steadying her more than the railing. When they reached the kitchen, he lit a lamp, filling the space with soft amber tones. The rain faded to a whisper outside, like the world itself was sighing with them. Sit, Caleb said. Li Mei sank onto the bench. Her eyes were red, her braid unraveled, her hands trembling faintly. Caleb poured her a cup of warm water, the closest thing to tea the boarding house had left. He placed it before her gently. Drink. She lifted the cup with both hands. The warmth seeped into her palms and up her wrists, grounding her. Caleb watched her, elbows braced on the table, his face unreadable in the flickering light. You shouldn't have had to face that alone, he said after a moment. Li Mei looked up. I wasn't alone. Caleb swallowed, the meaning of her words sinking deeper than either of them expected. He looked away briefly, then back at her. I stayed because I wanted to. The admission settled between them like something fragile and forbidden. Li Mei's breath stilled. Before she could speak, he continued, voice low and rough. I don't know how it happened. I don't know when. But something about you. Since the moment you stepped into my kitchen, it hasn't left me. Li Mei's heart beat painfully. She set the cup down with shaking fingers. Caleb. He leaned forward slightly, not touching her, but the closeness made the lantern flame tremble. You've brought something into that house I thought I'd lost for good. Quiet. Warmth. Peace. You make the place feel alive again. Her breath came shallow. I didn't mean to cause trouble, or gossip, or any of this. You didn't, he said firmly. They caused it, not you. She searched his face, finding sincerity there, and something deeper, something he had tried to bury but could no longer hide. Her throat tightened. Even if the town talks? Let them, he said quietly. Let them talk until their voices burn out. I'm done letting other people tell me what my life should look like. I know what feels right now. I know who feels right. Her heart thudded painfully. Caleb, don't say things you don't mean. I mean every word. Silence wrapped around them, not tense, not frightened, but tender, tremoring with possibility. Li Mei lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the weight of it. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her every chance to move away. When she didn't, he took her hand gently, as though she were a fragile piece of porcelain he'd vowed never to break. His thumb brushed the back of her hand with a reverence he didn't try to hide. Whatever she expected to happen next, it wasn't the softness of his voice. You turned my home into something I want to come back to, he whispered. Something I want to protect. Something I want to build a future around. Li Mei's breath trembled. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow this time, but from the terrifying, breathtaking shock of being wanted for the first time without conditions. I don't know how to be what you need, she whispered. He shook his head slowly. You already are. The lantern flickered as she looked up at him, her eyes shining. The world narrowed to the space between their hands. The smallest gesture, the gentlest connection, and yet more binding than any promise spoken aloud. And then, from upstairs, Hannah's voice, weak but clear, called Li Mei's name. Li Mei startled. Caleb released her hand immediately, though his warmth stayed against her skin. She rose, heart pounding, pulled between duty and the moment that had just opened like a fragile blossom. Caleb stood too, voice rough with feeling he didn't fully reveal. Go to her. I'll be right behind you. Li Mei paused at the doorway, eyes lingering on him with a mixture of fear, hope, and something she wasn't ready to name. Then she turned and hurried up the stairs, lantern light trailing behind her, while Caleb watched, knowing the choice he had made tonight would change everything. And knowing, for the first time in years,